office tonight for our first live stream event. We'd love to welcome you all here, but at the moment that's not possible, so we'd still like to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments tonight, it'd be great if you put those in the chat on the YouTube window, or if you want, you can email help@beargley.ch and we'll get to your questions and comments. We've got author Diccon Bewes with us tonight. He's the lead editor of the Expert Guide to Your Life in Switzerland. And I spoke to Diccon 2 years ago about writing the Bible to Your Life in Switzerland. And actually, he ended up not writing this book, and then a little bit differently. Can you explain how this book is put together?
It was really put together because I didn't want to write every chapter. And the idea we came up with is that every chapter is written by a different expert in their field, so that you're really getting the information from the horse's mouth. So for instance, the first chapter on immigration and visas and permits is written by the Federal Office of Migration. So hopefully they know what they're talking about, far better than me anyway. And so then we have health and families and jobs and really serious subjects written by serious people, and then we have slightly lighter subjects to give you inspiration for living here, whether that's travel or leisure or meeting Swiss people or enjoying Swiss food. So I helped each of the authors with their chapters, and then I wrote 4 of the chapters myself, which you then expertly edited.
So that's the starting point to this evening. All these different chapters, of course, we'd like to tell you everything about this. We'd also love to have all these experts here with us in the office. But what we did tonight is we asked ourselves, what are the 12 most important questions that anyone who lives in Switzerland should know? And then I challenged Diccon to try to answer each of those questions in 2-minute answers, which he's going to do for you tonight. We'd love to hear from you if you think if you think he did well with his answers. We'd also like to hear from you if you think you'd like to hear other questions. Put your answers in the chat or email them to help@beargley.ch. Just know that we're speaking to you slightly from the future, or about a minute in the future, and so it'll take us a little while to get to your questions and your comments. So we're going to jump right into our first question. Diccon, did William Tell actually exist?
This is a great question because any answer you give is bound to annoy some Swiss people. Because although William Tell is everywhere, he sells beer, he is on advertising posters all over the place, he didn't actually exist. I know that's a terrible thing to say sitting here in Switzerland. He is a myth more than a man, and he was a myth that was created with the help of 2 foreigners, a German playwright and an Italian opera composer. And he became the Swiss version of Robin Hood, this national hero who helped Switzerland defy the Austrians. Although he didn't exist, you can see him around Switzerland. The most famous place is his statue in Altdorf in Canton Uri. That's where the apple shooting incident took place, where he shot the apple off his son's head. Or you can go to just around the corner from there, a little meadow called Rütli, which is where Switzerland allegedly was born in 1291. William Tell wasn't there, although he does appear there in the play. And of course, whenever you're talking about William, you have to be careful that 64% of Swiss people do believe he did exist, so just never say anything rude about him.
Thanks, Diccon. Okay, we want to reward you for watching tonight. We want to reward you also for commenting and emailing your questions. We're going to do that by running a giveaway throughout the evening. Post your questions and comments, and we have Kali sitting here with us in the office tonight. She's going to be looking through your questions and comments, and she's going to be choosing winners at random. We're not looking for the best questions or the best comments, and she's going to choose 4 or 5 people through this evening tonight, and they can choose whatever book from our shelves that they'd like to have. At the end of the show, we'll tell you which books those are. I do want to reward Try Jim 1, who's our first commenter of the night, for jumping the gun and giving us the first question. Try Jim, if you will email help@beargley.ch, tell us your name and your address, then we'll get in touch about how you can get your free book. And I've got to ask Diccon, Try Jim 1's question is to share some tips about the best cheese fondue.
Well, that's quite hard because every part of Switzerland has their own favourite or best cheese fondue. My 2 tips would be, 1, go to a restaurant because if you make it at home, your house will stink for days afterwards. And second, go to what is very often seen as the traditional home of fondue, the village of Gruyere, because a very typical fondue is called moitié-moitié, which is half Gruyere cheese, half Vacherin cheese. And if you go to Gruyere, it's a beautiful little village. Almost every single restaurant serves fondue, without exception. So it's the best place to go to try it. If you are doing it at home, just remember, keep the place well ventilated.
Okay, and now our next question, we're going to jump in with a hard one. How does the referendum system work?
The short answer is far better than in Britain. The long answer is that referendums here happen every 3 months or so at local level, cantonal level, and also federal level. So the Swiss people are asked about anything and everything, whether that's fighter jets or shop opening hours, and they get to decide. And there are 3 main types of vote. The least frequent and the easiest to understand is the obligatory referendum, which is when Switzerland is joining an international organisation like the European Union, if it were ever to join, or changing the constitution, like giving women the vote, which happened in 1971, rather amazingly. Those don't happen very often, as you can imagine, so it's more likely that there'll be an optional referendum, which is where Parliament passes a law, and people then have 100 days to collect 50,000 signatures to contest that law. And it can be any law or any part of any law, and the vote then is a simple majority. People say yes or no to what Parliament has decided. These happen quite frequently, but generally the voters support what government and Parliament have done. The most common type, and the one that gets the most publicity, is called the popular initiative. It's kind of like the people's referendum, and that is at the beginning of the process, so you have 18 months to collect 100,000 signatures nationwide, and you can force a vote on any issue at all. And this happens every few months or so, and it can be on anything, as long as it's not unconstitutional. So you cannot ban Muslims, but there was a successful referendum to ban minarets. And as soon as the result is known, Parliament then has to try and enact it into law. It doesn't become law straight away. Parliament has to create a law from the result of the referendum. Not as complicated as it sounds. It's a little bit like Eskimos and snow, with 3 different words for the same thing, especially if you come from an English-speaking country where generally we just have a vote.
Okay, thank you. So the expert guide, we really tried in this book to have hard themes like referendums, but also a main focus of the book is enjoying life in Switzerland, shopping, travel,
food.
Those are that we really have some authors who really, there's lots of nice photos, and it's really was a great chance for the authors to really explain how great life is in Switzerland. The next one is sort of on that theme, but something that surprises people a lot when they arrive in Switzerland. The question is, why are opening hours so restricted?
It's not because we're living in 1980, although it does feel like that sometimes. It's really all to do with the work-life balance, not just for retail workers, but for everyone. Before I came to Switzerland, I was in London with 24-hour opening, and the temptation is always there, especially on a Sunday, to go shopping because you can't think of anything better to do. Whereas actually here you spend a lot more time with friends or family, or quality time on your own. And of course, like many things, opening hours are decided by a referendum, as we've just discussed. And generally, people vote against extending opening hours or having Sunday opening because they realise how important work-life balance is for everyone. So this means that Sundays are still Sundays in terms of shops being closed, except in train stations and airports. There is no 24-hour opening. There are a couple of exceptions, so tourist shops in like Interlaken and places can open on a Sunday. And also you can have local differences within the federal law. So for instance, in Zurich, shops are open till 8 p.m. on a Saturday, which in Bern is unthinkable because they close at 5. And so as long as you comply with national law, you can have differences locally.
Great, thanks. Again, those of you who are watching, if you'd like to win a book tonight, all you have to do is give us a comment or send an email to help@berkeley.ch. We're going to choose our second winner already now, which is a commenter called Neon Lass, who asked a really nice question that I'm going to give right to Diccon. The question is, first of all, it says, Neon Lass, if you send us an email to help@berkeley.ch, let us know your address, we'll get in touch with you about how to get a book. The question is, what's the most common question you get asked about life in Switzerland, and what is the most bizarre?
The most common question, luckily, is the one we've just answered, and that's just why I put it in there. I think a lot of people who are newly arrived in Switzerland really struggle with the opening hours, especially if they come from an English-speaking country like America or Britain or Australia, where we're used now to shops being open a lot. And so people really can't understand, A, why it happens, and B, why Swiss people support it so readily to have these restrictive opening hours in the age of the internet, when of course you can shop online whenever you want. So it seems a bit anachronistic, but it's just the way it is. The most bizarre, that's a hard one. I'll think about that and come back to you. Okay,
well, we're getting some questions on the chat, but I'm going to, don't worry, we are noticing you're submitting your questions, and Kali is here to choose some winners throughout the evening. But I'm going to jump back into our third question. The next question for Diccon is, how can I reduce my monthly health insurance premiums?
Oh, that's a tough one. First, I should say you have no choice. You have to have health insurance. It is obligatory for every resident. So the one thing you cannot do is cancel your health insurance. And your premium, the monthly premium you pay, depends on your age, whether you're over 25 or not, where you live, and what policy you choose. So short of moving house, really the only thing you can change is the policy. And there are three ways of changing that. The most obvious is to switch insurers. There are about 60 different health insurers in the market, and they all have to offer the same basic coverage by law. So you can easily compare like with like and different prices because you know that you're getting the same coverage. That's one way. A second way is to stay with your current insurer and to switch to a discount model. And there are two main discount models. One is the house doctor model, which I have, where you always have to go to your GP or your house doctor first, and then he will refer you to clinics. The other model is a telephone line, which you always have to phone the insurance helpline first, and then they will tell you whether to go to the doctor or whether to go to a specialist. Of course, in both those models, emergencies are the exception. You can go straight to hospital. The last way, which is probably the most complicated to get your head around, is you can raise your deductible. Your deductible is the amount you pay each year, no matter what happens. If you get any bills, you pay the first 300 up to the first 2,500 francs each year. Those deductibles are set by law. They can't go higher than that. But of course, if you choose the highest deductible, 2,500, your premium is then lower. The risk is if you get really ill, you obviously have to pay all 2,500 and not only 300. You can do all three of those together if you want. The most important thing to remember is always read the small print, know how much notice you have to give. Generally, to change insurers, you have to give notice by the end of this month, by the 30th of November, so that on the 1st of January you can start your new policy.
Okay, lots of questions coming in the chat. I'll point out to the expert guide really answers a lot of these questions really well. We have from Carol asking us whether a car or a train is the right solution for travel in Switzerland. Dimitri, who wrote our travel chapter, is really one of his strengths. He's done a great job of, there's dozens of different suggestions for the best ways to travel by car and the best ways to travel by train in the book. Dav's asking about job portals, which actually is a theme we're going to get to in a couple of minutes, jobs. So we'll get to that in 1 minute. I'm going to jump right into a question that's really important for a lot of people when they arrive in Switzerland, particularly now. And that is, what's the best way to make friends in Switzerland?
The short answer is it can be hard. You have to be patient. It's not that the Swiss are unfriendly, it's that they respect your privacy and expect you to do the same. And so especially if you don't work, or at the moment are working from home, you don't have access to work colleagues as a friend group, it can feel like you're a bit cut off. But there are things you can do yourself. It's not up to the Swiss to become your friends. You do have to make a bit of an effort. They already have lots of friends on the whole. The first thing I would always suggest is learn the language, whether that's French or German or Italian or even Romansh if you want to speak to 35 other people. Because as soon as you learn the language, you have another door open to you, even if it's only talking to people in the supermarket or at the market or at the bus stop. So make an effort, go to language classes, learn at home, do something to help your language skills. Secondly, you can be very Swiss and join a club. Swiss people love being part of a club. And this could be even an expat club where Swiss and foreigners mingle. There are plenty of those in the bigger cities, or it could be a local club based on interests that you share, whether that's hiking or running or stamp collecting or baking. And then really you do have to put yourself out there a little bit without being that annoying foreigner invading people's privacy, but at least introduce yourself to your neighbours, invite work colleagues out for a drink after work, or maybe go to lunch with them. So it's really down to you to make the effort. And in the book, Christian, who wrote this wonderful chapter on social life and how to mix in, he says there are 4 stages of friendship in Switzerland. First it's stranger, then it's acquaintance, then it's colleague, then it's friend. So there's no such thing as friends on Facebook within 10 minutes of meeting. Friendship means something here and you have to get there slowly.
Okay, wow, we've got lots of questions coming in. We'd like to get to all of them. We're not going to be able to do that tonight, but Kali is choosing winners for our giveaway. And the next winner she chose was Carol Burke or Carol Bierk. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her last name. But if you'll email us at help@bergli.ch, then we'll get in touch about how you can get your free book. I'm going to ask you, though, Kristen Luti's question. There's significant, because it's one that I actually don't quite know the answer to, so I'm going to challenge you to answer it.
Okay.
There is a significant effort put into recycling here in Switzerland. Are these materials really recycled? In many countries, such as the USA, much of this material actually ends up in landfills. Ooh.
That is a hard question. But recently, before Corona, before our lives changed completely, there were reports on television on the Swiss news about how plastics were no longer being sent to China, and so what was going to happen to them, or how recycling centres here were getting so full that people were, for the first time, being charged to use them, even just to recycle basics. So it is a problem. They are recycled. When I wrote my very, very first book 10 years ago, Swiss Watching, I did look into this a bit. And your plastic PET bottle, which has nothing to do with pets in English, but the plastic PET bottle, which you can recycle quite easily in Switzerland, actually goes to make parachutes for the paragliders in Interlaken, for instance, or it takes 25 bottles to make a fleece for mountain hikers. So they are put to good use for very Swiss things. And recycling rates here are quite high. They're over 90% for most things. I think we've got a question about that later, which people always ask about recycling and rubbish. But I think it's a good thing that the Swiss are eco-conscious and that also things do actually happen properly to the recycling.
Okay, great. We're going to jump into a question about work. I think this is a change that we've had, that it used to be that we used to speak about expats, which were people who would move to Switzerland for a job, and if they lost that job or they wanted to leave that job, then they just move back to wherever they came from. I think more and more people are moving to Switzerland as a choice, as a lifestyle choice, and deciding to stay here. So more people from the international community are then faced with having to change jobs within Switzerland. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what should I bear in mind when applying for a job?
I'm quite lucky. I've only ever applied for one job in Switzerland because this is now my job, and my application was to myself. Rebecca has written an amazing chapter, and I learned so much working with her about job applications. So if you want the really in-depth guide, then the jobs chapter in the expert guide really does it all. And I think what I can focus on without being an expert on the job market is what is different here when you're actually applying for the job. And I think what amazed me was I brought my CV from England, and the first thing I had to do was put my photo on it, because although that seems like very old-fashioned, especially in American Britain, where CVs are becoming more and more anodyne, here you must have personal data like your date of birth, your marital status, your immigration status, and have a photo. I have friends who work in HR, and they say, yes, if it doesn't have a photo, how do we know what they look like? So they go in the bin. So that's really important. It seems a bit strange for us. Another one is if you do have job references from previous jobs, make sure you copy them and include them as long as they're relevant. In Britain, it's very normal not to have references and that you give the referee's name to your prospective employer and they contact each other. Here it's more normal to include references. And lastly, of course, at the interview, be punctual. This is Switzerland. Make eye contact, shake hands, smile, and remember to use the formal form of address in French, German, or Italian because it's a formal situation. And the biggest problem most people face is that salaries are not mentioned in job adverts on the whole. You have to know what you are worth, you have to know what the job is worth, and you have to be willing to trade that off in the interview. It's usually part of the interview process, being asked, what do you think you should earn, or what do you think the job should earn? And you have an idea, they have an idea, and you try and meet in the middle. It's very uncomfortable for people who don't like speaking about money or are not used to negotiating their salary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks to Anna for the nice compliment on Diccon on all of his books, and that he's been helpful in settling into your new life here. And also thanks to Neon Lass, who pointed out that landfill, the word landfill for an American or someone from the UK means a place where you dump all your trash, but in Switzerland actually landfills are generally places after the incinerator here.
Yes.
Trash is burned, and then it's the ashes that then are placed in the landfill. Okay, but we're going to jump into a travel chapter, which gets back to Carol's question way back from earlier in the chat, which is comparing cars and trains in Switzerland. And the question is, what are the best scenic train rides?
That's really hard for me to choose because I travel by train everywhere. I do not own a car. I have never owned a car, and I probably will never own one living in Switzerland because the public transport system is so amazing. But I would say there are some things you can only do by car to answer that question. So, for instance, going over the Four Passes Drive in the centre of Switzerland is an amazing day's drive, but I just hired a car for the day and did it. I would always travel by train. Some train rides are perfectly normal train rides, but are wonderfully scenic. For instance, going from Bern to Lausanne on the train, if you sit on the left-hand side of the train facing forward, you come out of the tunnel after Fribourg and you suddenly have the whole of Lake Geneva on your left-hand side. It's not even designated a scenic train ride, but it is wonderful. But of the ones that are official scenic rides that everyone wants to do and are all worth doing, I would say my three favourites are the Bernina Express, which runs from Chur through the mountains of Graubünden down into Italy, in Tirano. It's an amazing combination of tunnels and bridges and viaducts and mountains, and definitely worth doing no matter what time of year. Jungfraujoch is one of the most famous train rides. It's the highest train station in Europe. And I think, even though it is expensive, and you will probably gulp at the price, it is worth every minute and every penny, not just for the views when you get up to 3,634 metres. It's the train ride up there. This was built over 100 years ago up inside the Eiger. It's an amazing engineering feat. And then one which is quite short, it's only 30 minutes. I love the train ride from Zermatt up to Gornergrat, which is the highest open-air station in Europe. And all the way along you get the most wonderful views of the Matterhorn, which everyone knows, of course. But then when you get to the top and you get out of the train, you can see this amazing alpine panorama, including Switzerland's highest mountain, Dufourspitze. So it's definitely worth the 30 minutes extra if you're ever going to Zermatt.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to move on to a question about family. Family is also a really important chapter in the expert guide, talking about schools, talking about the difference, some different philosophies between raising children here versus other countries. The question for you tonight is, how are primary schools different here?
Well, first of all, I should say I have no primary school age children. I never have had and never will have. So everything I know about schools is from Isabel, who wrote the chapter, and she taught me a lot. And of course here I think we have to focus on local schools rather than international schools. So in local schools there are a couple of really important things you have to remember. Firstly, primary school is compulsory for 8 years. That includes the 2 years of kindergarten, which is generally from age 4. So it's 4 to 12. You normally cannot choose your school. It is allocated to you based on the municipality where you live. And there are no school rankings, so it's not a question of, oh, I should live here because this school is better. It's seen that all schools are equal. Children normally walk to school on their own. The first day you're allowed to take them, but after that it's kind of frowned upon because this is a way of children learning their independence. And so it is quite normal to see 7, 8-year-old children walking to school on their own with their little reflective vests on. It kind of freaks a lot of expat parents out for the first few times, and then they get used to it. And lastly, school lunches are not the norm here. Generally, children go home for lunch. And also generally, there's no school on a Wednesday afternoon. So this can make it difficult for working parents. If both parents are at work, they do have to organise childcare or pay for lunches at day schools. So those are the broad differences, even at a young age, that are more sort of cultural differences. One important one, which at the moment doesn't happen because of Corona, is children have to shake hands with the teacher when they arrive at school every day. And for a lot of foreign children, that's something alien, but they learn very quickly that it's the normal culture here.
Good. Again, we're giving away books in the giveaway tonight. So if you want to make comments in the chat, then we're choosing people, or Kali, who's here with us tonight, is choosing people at random to give books away to. She's chosen our next winner, Anna, now I've got to say your last name, Georiva. Thanks for your 2 comments, and you just made an interesting point. Diccon earlier mentioned that he thinks learning the local language is one of the best ways to meet friends, but you also pointed out that not only is speaking the language a great way to make friends, you also met a lot of people in your German class when you arrived in Switzerland, which I think is a great point. And if you'll email help@berkeley.ch, we'll get in touch about how you can get your free book. Now we're going to jump back into a question about daily life. The question is, what are the recycling and rubbish rules?
Well, we've touched on this already. The most important thing to remember is in most places now in Switzerland, you pay for every single bag of rubbish you put out. And so that means the more you recycle, the less rubbish you have, so the less you pay. So you might argue that the Swiss are very eco-conscious, but they're also very money-conscious. And so making there a financial incentive to recycling is one reason why recycling rates are very high here. So you buy bags either from the supermarket or from your local council, and you must put the rubbish out in those bags, or you buy stickers to put on normal rubbish bags. Most plastic recycling is bottles, whether that's water bottles or fizzy drink bottles. Those go back to your local supermarket. They have to take them back. If they sell drinks, they have to take the bottles back, or their bottle banks in various places. Other plastic packaging, like the carton underneath the strawberries and things, generally cannot be recycled here yet. It's one of the big failures of the Swiss recycling system. Plastic is limited to plastic bottles. Glass and metal you can take back to recycling centres which are either in your neighbourhood, big underground bins, and you just drop them in. Remember, you cannot do that on a Sunday, and normally not any evening either, because you're disturbing people's peace. And then of course you have big recycling centres. Most communities have one or somewhere nearby. And there you can take almost everything, but also larger items that you want to get rid of, or things that you're not allowed to put in the rubbish because rubbish is typically burnt, like polystyrene blocks. And there you take them to the recycling centre, and most these days you have to pay. They weigh what you're bringing back and you pay per weight, or it's per item. But it's a very good way of getting rid of larger things that otherwise you would either be stuck with, or you could be tempted just to leave on the side of the road.
Okay, wow, thank you. One of the most important chapters in the expert guide is money. For most of us, Daniel really wrote a great chapter there. He has such a great grasp of the Swiss, of how salaries work, how pensions work, how taxes work. Really a wealth of information in that chapter. And Daniel was supposed to be with us here tonight to answer some of your questions about money, but because of Corona, he can't be here. So Diccon's going to have to fill in for this next question. Diccon.
I will try.
I've heard about pension pillars. What are they?
Okay, they aren't actual pillars. They do not hold up buildings. They are not part of the Swiss National Bank. It's more sort of 3 components of the Swiss national pension system. The first pillar is pretty much the same as in most other countries. It's the state pension. You make a contribution. Contributions are mandatory, whether you're employed or not. So even unemployed people have to make a contribution, and this is mandatory for all residents. If you are employed, your employer pays half and you pay half of the percentage. That's the relatively simple one. Then comes the second pillar, which is the occupational pension or the company pension. This is also mandatory for anyone who is employed and earns over 21,330 francs a year. So if you're just working part-time 1 day a week and you earn under that, then you're not obliged to join. You can, but you're not obliged to. And there's a sliding scale of contributions, and again, it's shared by the employer and employee. And the last one, the third pillar, is the voluntary part. And that is contributions paid into a pension scheme. I have mine at the Swiss Post Office. And there are maximum levels depending on whether you're self-employed or employed. Now, all of those contributions, no matter which pillar, are tax deductible. But all of those pensions, when you get them at retirement age, which is 64 for women and 65 for men, they are taxable income. So although you get tax-free contributions, you have to pay tax on the pension. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts in the end.
Okay, thank you. Again, we're bouncing back between your questions in the chat. So if you have any questions or comments, please enter them in the chat. And then we're also, we've done 9 questions. We've got, we've done 10 questions. We've got 2 more to go in the next 9 minutes. But I really like Paula's question, which is, first she thanks us for the interesting discussion. And then she asks, is there something that you still find difficult after all these years here?
Yes, I can answer that straight away. It's the fact that Swiss people are genetically incapable of queuing. And it might be that British people really queue too much. I mean, I stand at a bus stop in London and I form a queue of 1. But here I find, for such a polite, efficient, wonderful country, the fact that people do not like to queue, it's still really is hard after 15 years of living here, especially the old ladies with sharp elbows and big bags who push you out the way to get on the tram first. So yes, I find that hard.
Okay, thank you. Another really important chapter in the expert guide is the housing chapter written by Caroline. And she really did a great job talking about all the things you have to worry about in the contracts, the difference between buying a house, renting, all of the different questions you have to deal with housing in Switzerland. And the question we have for you about housing is, what should I be aware of when moving house?
I think you can start by saying that Switzerland is a nation of renters. Only 37% of the country owns their own home. So there's a lot of people renting, and therefore a fair amount of people moving house when they change flats. And there are certain rules about moving house in Switzerland, and it's not only when you move in, but when you move out. Firstly, most flats and houses that you rent are unfurnished, and so it's really crucial that when you move in with the landlord, you go around and make an inspection of the property. This can take 2 to 3 hours because you literally inspect everything. You check every light fitting is working, you check every key works in the lock. You also note down anything that you could be held responsible for when you eventually move out. So cracks in the wall or damage to paintwork or things that aren't working. It's really, really crucial to check everything, and the landlord will not mind if you're quite picky about it because it's easier for him or her in the long run as well. You then also, you have to know what you're paying for, because if you're renting, for example, are you paying for the TV license? Probably not, because that's an individual thing. Are you paying for the electricity, or is that down to the landlord? Are you paying for cleaning of the stairwell? Because generally people in Switzerland live in flats, so they've got 8 or 10 flats in a building. Who pays for the communal areas? What utilities are included? So again, it's very easy to be very clear and very upfront about it and just ask for a list of what's included and what's not. Lastly, if you are moving out onto a new home, you must leave the place in the condition in which you found it, give or take a bit of normal wear or tear. So in other words, it should be pristine. And this very often for a lot of people involves hiring professional cleaners or even a painter to get rid of all those nail marks of where you put up pictures or where your children scribbled over the walls. So don't be afraid of that, just be aware that whatever you checked in, you have to check out at the end of the process.
Thank you. We've got a great couple of comments from New in Zurich, which I suspect might be our author Christina,
I think it probably is.
Who wrote the Daily Life chapter.
And we didn't set her up to do this.
Yeah, but she's got two great comments. One of them is that when getting rid of items that are still in good condition, don't forget you can donate to Brocky's. You can tell us what a Brocky is?
A Brocky is it's a second-hand shop or a second-hand charity. In Britain, we would call them a charity shop. So the largest one across the country is the Salvation Army. And they have not only clothes and crockery, it's furniture as well. So you can go to a big Salvation Army second-hand shop and they'll have sofas and beds and cupboards and everything you might need, especially if you have just moved to Switzerland and you don't have any furniture. It's often a good place to start. And it makes an alternative to IKEA because you are actually helping someone.
And New in Zurich's other comment is one of the best ways to make friends in Switzerland is to get a dog.
If your building allows dogs.
Good point. Okay, we're coming up to our last question, and right on time, which is, Diccon, when can I switch to the informal form of you?
For most English speakers, this really is a minefield of mistakes because English is very simple. We say you. It doesn't matter if you know someone or don't know them, if they're the Queen or the cleaner, or if there are four of them or one of them. But in all of the Swiss national languages, there are lots of forms of you depending on whether it's formal or informal, singular or plural. Obviously, the singular plural is relatively easy, so the formal informal is the harder. And Margaret gives some very clear rules in the book on etiquette, the chapter on etiquette. Essentially, you're informal with family and friends, once you've made them, and with people who are younger than you, so like children. You are formal with anyone you don't know, anyone who is older than you, or anyone who is higher up the food chain, so your boss, for instance. And the switch between those, so essentially the switch from formal to informal, so in German it would be from Sie to du, in French it would be vous to tu, is either by mutual consent, so with a work colleague, for instance, or a neighbor. You say, oh, let's move to informal you. And you might even have a drink and toast that moment. Or it's by you being invited to do it by someone who has a higher status than you, i.e. your boss or the old lady who lives across the road from you. So generally it's not really the done thing to start using the informal form unless you've agreed it or unless you've been asked to do it. Of course, when you're learning a language, it's hard to remember. And when I was learning German, I was being formal with my mother-in-law and being informal with the old man on the tram and getting it all mixed up. I think I've now got it.
Great, okay, those are our 12 questions, what we think are the 12 most important questions. We got one more winner to our giveaway that I'm going to announce in a moment. Before we do that, we're going to give you a few recommendations about books that you might want to buy if you'd like to know a little bit more about things we've talked about. Of course, The Expert Guide to Your Life in Switzerland, I think, is the Bible for life in Switzerland, really a must-have for anyone who wants to enjoy a successful life here in Switzerland. Some other books we'd like to tell you about, though, is for those of you who have little kids from age 4 to 8, is The Monster Book of Switzerland. Jean Darling's written, she's retold a bunch of great Swiss legends in this book, and it's beautifully illustrated by Michael Meister. If you'd like a book for slightly older kids, Swisstory, The Untold, Bloody, and Absolutely Real History of Switzerland came out this spring. Also by Michael Meister, illustrator, and by Laurie Toyer, writer, and this just won the International Crystal Kite Award for the best children's book, Europe, Africa, and Middle East, I think.
Most of the world, then.
Most of the world.
Yeah.
Most of the world. Many of you know our History in a Nutshell series. We've got 4 books in a Nutshell series now: Swiss history, Swiss democracy, Swissness in a nutshell, and coming in 3 weeks is the Swiss economy in a nutshell. And the best-selling Swiss-German guide of all time is Hoi, Your New Swiss-German Survival Guide by Sergio Levano and Nicole Egger. They've written really, all of you who are terrified about learning Swiss-German, dealing with this minefield of High German versus Swiss German, this is just the book to take away all of those fears. And the last one that I want to introduce before Diccon mentions that we have two wonderful books by Andy Pilot to introduce Swiss cooking and Swiss drinks to you. Decided to show that the cooking book is Helvetic Kitchen behind me, and Drink Like the Swiss is the book about Swiss drinks, which really is a perfect book for this winter when it's not as easy to go to restaurants or bars and you want to experiment on your own. And Diccon brought one book along today that he'd like to recommend.
This is Slow Train to Switzerland, which actually came out a few years ago, but in Britain has just been awarded one of the best top 20 travel writing books for you to read during lockdown when you can't travel. It's the story of the very, very first package tour, which was created by a man called Thomas Cook, who was a real man before he became a travel agent. And he brought a group of middle-aged, middle-class people from Britain to Switzerland for 3 weeks on the first package tour. And a woman on that tour called Miss Jemima wrote a diary, and I travelled the same route as the tour with her diary as my guide to see how much Switzerland had changed. So it's partly social history, it's partly a travelogue, hers and mine, 150 years apart, and to show you that although the scenery hasn't really changed, apart from the glaciers melting, Switzerland itself has changed a lot, because the Switzerland she describes is full of beggars and poverty and illness and disease, and it's definitely not the Switzerland we know from living here today.
Okay, and so our last winner for the giveaway is Paola Chirazzi. If you'd like to email us at help@bergli.ch, we'll let you know how you can get your free book. We're almost out of time, 1 minute left, but I would like to ask Diccon the last question that's just come up in the chat, which I think is a good one to finish the night with. Diccon, could you share some curious insights and impressions from your citizenship application process?
I became Swiss in May after 2.5 years, so you have to be patient. Okay, I was in Bern, and Bern is famous for being slow. But generally, you have to be patient. You have to expect quite intrusive questions. So I needed to even talk about what my parents did and their lives as well as my own. You do have to have a knowledge of Switzerland. In Bern, it's a written test. Other cantons, it's an oral test. And you obviously have to pass a language exam. Take lots of deep breaths. Don't get frustrated when you're asked ridiculous questions like, how can you prove you are single? Well, I'm single because I'm not married, but how can I prove that? Because it never happened, so how do I prove something that never happened? It's a really hard one to get around when you're asked that question. Just remember that don't make jokes. Treat it very seriously, and you will get there in the end. I did it 2.5 years, a lot of frustration in the middle, but it's worth it.
Okay, thanks. That's all the time we have tonight. I'd like to thank Diccon for being here. I'd like to thank our helpers who are sitting behind the computers and the cameras, and then I'd like to thank Kali also for helping with our giveaway. I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. All of the answers to the questions tonight will be available on YouTube as short 2-minute answers. So if you forgot something that Diccon said, or you'd like to tell someone that Diccon has some great answers, please check out our YouTube channel, and you'll see those answers appear in the next few weeks. We'll also be around Switzerland in the next year after the situation loosens up a bit with the expert guide with some events. If you'd like to have Diccon or one of our experts at your club or at your workplace, or if you have another idea for a venue, get in touch about events. We're always looking for cooperation. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight. Hope to see you soon.